Chapter 1 of Hardcase by Luke Short. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Hardcase by Luke Short. Chapter 1. Yellow Jacket's post office was a rack of pigeonholes in the front corner of Beatty's Emporium. Around 11 o'clock each morning, after the mail stage from Sabinal got in, the loafers lounged on the dry goods counter while the old man Beatty sorted out the mail. This morning the procedure was no different than usual. In the drift of idle talk and low laughter from beyond the rack of pigeonholes, old Beatty squinted through his bifocals at the topmost letter of a stack he held in his left hand, and with his right hand he deliberately placed it in its correct box. Fred Curtis, the clerk, was taking care of the trade beyond the post office. Nobody saw old Beatty when it happened. He had just read the address of a letter and had his hand halfway to the general delivery cubbyhole when his hand paused, and then as the name he had read sank into his consciousness, he dropped the letter like he would have dropped a hot iron. Gingerly, he picked it up again and read, Mr. Dave Coyle, General Delivery, Yellow Jacket, New Mexico Territory. Hold till September 1st and return. Old Beatty's panic was immediate and complete. The first thing he did was natural enough. He poked his head out of the wicket and surveyed the loafers in the store. He knew them all, men, women, and children, and still he was uneasy. The second thing he did was explainable. He looked at the feed mill calendar on the wall behind him and it said August 31st. The third thing he did was pure instinct. He called up to the clerk. "Finish sorting this mail, Fred," and left the store, taking the letter with him. Across the wide and dusty street, wedged in between two wooden awninged buildings, was the sheriff's office, and old Beatty made for it. He tramped into the small office to find Sheriff Harvey Beale, his feet cocked up on the roll-top desk in conversation with his deputy, Ernie C. Old Beatty put the letter on the desk and said hoarsely, "Take a look, Harv." Beale was a bland-faced, heavy-set man whose wide and innocent blue eyes were trusting and affable. He was also a slow-moving man, but now, because he read the excitement in old Beatty's face, he moved with alacrity. He picked up the letter, read the address, and came out of his chair like he'd been kicked out. "Where did you get this?" he demanded swiftly. Old Beatty, besides being testy, was scared too, and he said truculently, "It's got a stamp on it, ain't it? I didn't print it. It come in the mail." Ernie C. reached over and took the letter from the sheriff's hand. Ernie was a slow reader, but it didn't take him long to read this name because it was familiar enough to him. He dropped the letter and said, "Wow," and looked blankly at the sheriff, his young face surprised. Beale said, "Did you look at the crowd in the store?" Without waiting for an answer, he went to the door and looked swiftly up and down the tie rails on both sides of the street, then closed the door. Beatty said, "I knowed everyone in the store." "Ernie," Bill said swiftly, "you go camp on Beatty's counter till I get this fixed up." "Not me," Ernie said slowly. I got a 3-day vacation coming, Harv. I'm taking it, starting now." Beale eyed him with deceptive mildness. "You're a deputy of this county." "That's right, a live one," Ernie said. "I aim to stay alive, too." Bill stepped over to the desk and pulled out a lower drawer and rummaged in it. He was a somewhat ridiculous figure to a stranger, a fat and rotund and polite man in outsized pants, half boots that were run over at the heels, and a buttonless black vest over a too small calico shirt. But a careful man might consider this. Beale's hands were soft and uncalloused, which argued he had done no manual work in a long time. Which argued, since Yellow Jacket was a cattle county with a reasonably high homicide rate, that he and his office managed to take care of any trouble that came up. And since he seemed anything but a scrapper, a careful man might consider the deputy. He would have been right, too, for Ernie C. was the sheriff's office. Beale found what he was looking for and laid it on his desk and looked at his deputy. "Read it," he said. "I read it," Ernie said stubbornly. "Hell, I know it by heart. $7,000 alive or dead for Dave Coyle." Beale wheeled to face old Beatty. "You read it." "I got one in the post office," Beatty said sourly. "Well, divide it by 3 and see what each of us will make," Beale said. Old Beatty looked carefully at him and said, "Harv, I'm going to be sick tomorrow, sick in bed. I'm already sick now." Beale looked from Beatty to Ernie and back to Beatty. "One of you on vacation, one of you sick," he murmured scornfully. "Where's all the men in this town?" "I know where they'll be when you tell them," Ernie said. "They'll be out of town." "He ain't so tough," Bill countered.
If I was you, I'd whisper that,
Ernie said dryly. He's little. He's a runt, Bill said.
Stick of dynamite's only 8 inches high, Beatty said. He's over 5 feet and the same stuff.
But he's a kid. Just a tough kid, Bill insisted. You afraid of a kid? Ernie said dryly.
Don't look at me. I didn't print that reward notice. It's the U.S. Commissioner that's afraid of him. Me, I don't aim to bust up a 3-day fishing trip to meet him,
Bill said grimly. All right, Ernie, but make your trip longer than 3 days. Make it 3 months. Make it 3 years. Why not? Because you don't have to get back to work.
I'll get back to work, Ernie retorted. I've got a date here for September 2nd.
Not here.
No, I'll call at your house.
Bill looked blank.
Why? That's where a funeral usually starts, ain't it?
Ernie said. He waved his hand at Sheriff Bill, grinned, and stepped out onto the walk. Beatty started after him, and Bill said, Wait a minute, Beatty. I'll go with you.
No, you won't, Beatty said. I sleep in a single bed, and that's where I'm going.
Sheriff Bill settled down into his chair and watched Beatty leave. He didn't feel exactly cheerful himself, and he looked around to see if the door was closed. There was a kind of hot and greedy urgency within him, but he knew this would take a little thinking out. As long as the letter, the bait, was in his possession, Dave Coyle couldn't get it. He put the letter in his pocket just to make sure, and then considered. Was it a fake? He didn't know, but it seemed as if Dave Coyle had told somebody he'd drop in at Yellow Jacket before September 1st to get his mail. That was the way Dave Coyle did things, like the time he had gone into the governor's mansion the night of the inaugural ball and picked the blossom from a century plant to the governor's wife to wear in his buttonhole during the dance. He'd do anything that took gall, preferred to do it that way, and somehow this letter business seemed typical. Bill pictured $7,000 in gold. That was a lot of money. For $10 apiece, he could get 20 men to watch Beatty's store day and night, and when Dave Coyle called for his letter, it would be like shooting a clay pigeon. Sheriff Bill thought of something then. He remembered the return notation on the envelope. He pulled it out and looked at the back of it where the return address was given. Return to Box 73, Wagon Mound. Sheriff Bill grinned faintly then. The return was wrong. It should have read, Return the box to Wagon Mound. The box, of course, meaning the coffin. He went out then to start gathering recruits. Just after dark that night, a man rode up to the outskirts of Yellow Jacket and dismounted in the deep shade of a cottonwood tree that overhung the south road. He stretched with the smooth, clean movements of a cat, then set about a job that came easily to him. He knotted the reins, looped them over the horse's neck, slipped a bit, lifted the stirrups, and tied them together with a piece of string over the pommel and let out the cinch an inch or so. Afterward, he walked away, for this wasn't his own horse he had been riding. He didn't like to own a horse, hadn't owned one for years, and didn't intend to. It was a borrowed horse which he had taken in the last town. When he got ready to leave here, he would borrow a fresh one. He scuffed along silently in the dust of the road, a slight and shadowy figure, and long before he reached the section of town where the stores lighted the street, he paused and studied it. To a man less concerned than himself with appearance of things, the scene looked typical enough. There was usually one store in any town that stayed open at night and whose lamps laid bright squares of light far out into the street. But it went beyond that here. There were, he noticed, lights on only one side of the street, and why weren't there horses at the tie rail in front of the store? And why weren't people moving in the street? Why were they all loafing, sitting around? It all shaped up into the old familiar face of trouble, but he wanted to be sure. He vanished in an alley. Some minutes later, he again looked upon the street, this time from a position in the narrow weed and bottle-cluttered space between two buildings. He had already tried 3 similar spaces farther up the alley, and had found men with rifles across their knees, squatting in each of them. He already knew what to expect. All he wanted now was to make sure this brightly lighted store was also the post office. Through Beatty's window, he could see the mail racks, and he turned and went back to the dark alley. A man was walking up the alley, coming toward him. The man stopped. He stopped, too. "I'm getting sick of this," Dave Coyle said in the utter darkness. "Why don't he come?" "You and me both," the other said. "What are you using?" "A shotgun. I loaded her with washers." The man laughed. "That ought to take care of him." "I reckon," Dave said. "So long." And he walked down the alley, the man forgotten. There was a letter for him over there in the post office, sure enough. But instead of minding their business and letting him call for it, this bounty hunting crew wanted trouble. He didn't want trouble, though. He only wanted the letter. He was tramping down the alley when he caught a whiff of something that hauled him up in his tracks. It was the smell of warm ashes, of coal gas, and the faint lingering scent of burned hoofs. He followed the smell and came up to a large door that he knew was the rear of a blacksmith shop. He found the door unlocked, went inside, pulled the door to after him, and struck a match. The flare lighted a face that had graced a triple printing of reward dodgers. It was burned that same deep brown that had blurred the picture on the dodger and had made him look almost black. In shape, it was a tough face, tight-knit, flaring a little at the jaw hinge, and then sweeping in a clean line to a pointed chin that was faintly cleft. The nose, thin and high, had a faint white scar across the bridge, but it was the mouth that people noticed. Maybe that was because, on the reward dodger, it had been grinning crookedly, insolently, so that half the sheriffs who had gazed upon it had felt uncomfortably mad and had sworn under their breaths. It was that kind of mouth, shaped into a sneer, the upper lip lifted into one corner, the whole tilt of it derisive. The eyes were a perfect foil, wide-spaced, gray without a trace of blue, whose habitual innocence confounded people and was intended to. No reward dodger had ever carried a full-length picture, and for want of a better word, he had been described therein as small. It was true only if a man didn't associate the word puny with the description. Right now, a sun-faded blue shirt, worn Levi's, and scuffed half-boots covered his lean, smoothly muscled body, and nobody would have called it stocky. It had that long-legged, lazy grace that carried a hint of explosive possibilities. The gun, rammed carelessly into a wide and heavy shell belt, looked outsized against his small hand. A battered and curl-brimmed Stetson rode carelessly back-tilted on a shock of untidy blue-black hair. Before the match flare died, he had seen what he wanted. He went over to the forge, which was still warm, and tugged at the bellows rope. The small cup of glowing coals in the forge spread out now under the bellows wind, and when it was a cherry red, he reached for the coal shovel. He scattered a thin layer of fine fuel on the coals, blacking them out, and then, swiftly, he shucked up 24 shells from his shell belt and laid them on the black coal. Afterward, he softly opened the double front doors, then retreated through the rear door into the alley. It took him 3 minutes to walk down to the end of the alley, cross the street in the dark, and find the opposite alley that he was sure would lead past the loading platform of Beatty's store. He did not approach close, for he was certain men would be back there, too. He only hunkered down against a woodshed and began rolling a cigarette. When he heard the initial spatter of gunfire, his smoke was licked and pasted in one corner of his mouth. He listened. A man lunged into the light from the rear of Beatty's store and stopped. He called, "Hear that? They got him!" That was all that was needed. 6 men materialized out of the darkness and pounded down the alley, bound for the blacksmith shop, where the forge's heat had finally exploded the cartridges. Dave rose and walked slowly toward the store. He could hear men yelling out front and running on the boardwalk, and there were other shots now, the result of nerves gone edgy in the dark. Dave mounted the steps, paused to light his cigarette, and then went into the store. It was brightly lighted and, of course, deserted. $7,000, he reflected wryly, was too big a sum to keep a clerk on the job tonight. He walked the length of the store, hauled up at the mail rack, found the general delivery cubbyhole, and sorted the mail there. When he found his letter, he pocketed it, put the mail back, and went out the rear door again. This time he headed up the alley, and when it emptied into the side street, he turned left toward the main street. The corner building was the hotel. The clerk, like most of the other men in town, had deserted his post to run down street toward the gunfire that was still racketing. Dave walked in, chose a room key from the board behind the desk, and went upstairs. His room number 8 was a corner one, and he locked the door behind him. After lighting the lamp, yawning, pulling the shades, and removing his hat, he sat down by the lamp and opened the letter. It began, "Dear Mr. Usher." Dave stopped right there and stared at it. Then he leafed over the page and read the signature. It was signed to Carol McPhee. That part was all right. He turned back to the beginning. The greeting still puzzled him and began to read. "Dear Mr. Usher, I am in receipt of your letter asking me to put you in touch with Dave Coyle. Do you think me stupid, or are you insane? Every child in this territory knows that each of you is sworn to kill the other. Do you think I would betray Dave simply because you have a deal you think he'd like to talk over with you? I'm writing Dave tonight, warning him against you, if that's necessary, which it is not. Rather, I should warn you that he'll kill you on sight. I honestly believe that Governor Johns would pardon him if he killed you, so if I were in your shoes, I would take warning. Believe me, with all the ill will in the world, I am not sincerely yours and never will be. Carol McPhee." Dave stared at the note. He knew what had happened. Carol had written him and Will Usher on the same night and had put the letters in the wrong envelopes. He thought of something then. Suppose Carol had mentioned his presence in Yellow Jacket in her other letter. As soon as he thought of it, Dave lunged for the lamp, wiping out the flame with his hand. The envelope, which had been in his lap, fluttered to the floor and planed under the chair. And in that very instant, there was a knock on the door. Dave waited a moment and said softly, "Who is it?" There was a throaty chuckle from the other side of the door.
"Who'd you think it would be, Davy? It's me, Will Usher."
End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Hardcase by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Chapter 2. Dave said through the door, "I don't want trouble. Light her shut."
"Listen a minute, Dave," Will said.
"I want to talk to you." "Drag it."
"Wait a minute."
Usher's voice was urgent.
"I haven't got a gun, and this isn't a trap. Open the door."
Dave said softly, "I'll walk that door down and cut off your ears, Will. Here I come." He went to the door, unlocked it, and opened it with his right hand. His gun was in his left. There was nobody there. He stepped out into the hall and looked down it, and it was empty. He stepped back into the room again, locked the door, and lighted the lamp, a frown on his face. Carol, in her letter to him which Will Usher had received, mentioned Yellow Jacket, and Will was here. Beyond that, Will had the letter that Carol had written him, and he wanted it. He wanted the letter, and he didn't know whether he could trust himself to take it from Will Usher without getting into a fight, but he decided he could if he held his temper. He started across the room toward the door and was almost there when a knock came on the door again. He reached swiftly for the key, twisted it, flung the door open, and reached out and grabbed for Will Usher's coat lapel to yank him inside. His hand was swifter than his recognition, for he already was grasping the silk collar of a basque before he could stop himself, and then his hand fell away and he was confronting a girl who was almost as surprised as he was. "Why, howdy, Carol," he stammered.
"Hello, Dave," Carol said softly, swiftly. "I'm coming in, and close the door after me."
She brushed past him, and Dave shut the door behind her, then turned and leaned his back against it. He saw a girl who was smaller than he was and whose thick hair was pale as his was dark. Her face, with its almost up-tilted nose and its friendly mouth and deep violet-colored eyes, was too imprudent to be beautiful and had too much character in it to be called pretty. Right now it was frightened, too, and Dave smiled faintly. "You've grown up," he said. Carol stamped her foot.
"How can you joke now, Dave? Don't you know they're hunting you all over town?"
"Sure."
"You can't stay here.
Why not?"
"But they'll find you."
"Not till I want them to," Dave said calmly. "Not till I've talked to you." Carol sank down on the bed and put the flat of her palms to her temples. She shivered a little, and Dave looked at her curiously, his face impassive. He liked the blue color of the dress she was wearing, and he thought she looked nice, and he knew it wasn't because she was the first white woman he'd seen for a long time. He said, gently for him, "What's the matter?" Carol looked up.
"I'm just thinking what an awful fool I am. First, I sent Will Usher the wrong letter, and he found out you were here. Second, I addressed your letter in your own name, and so the whole town is hunting you. And now, well, Dad is with me. He's bound to find out you're here, and he'll head a posse for 3 weeks just to hunt you down."
Dave said, "You're flustered, I reckon. You was flustered when you sent me word in Mexico. You still are. Why?"
"Dave," Carol said, "will you please go, now? Will you please get out of town?"
"No."
I sent word to you in Mexico because I needed help. You see, I didn't forget that stage trip we had together when I came home from school. I couldn't very well forget it, could I, when it was in all the newspapers in the territory that you saved me from that gang of Will Usher's kidnappers?"
"You shouldn't have told him who I was."
"But I thought Dad would plead with Governor Johns for your pardon. I didn't know they'd chase you clear out of the territory into Mexico."
"Neither did I," Dave said carelessly.
"Then when this trouble came up, I sent for you because, well, I guess I thought you could help."
"What trouble?"
"Oh, it doesn't matter now," Carol cried. "You can't help. All you can do is get out while you can."
"What trouble?" Dave insisted.
"Dad's trouble. Haven't you heard that we're losing all our range on a forged deed?"
Dave scowled. "Who forged it?"
"Tate Wallace. He owns the Three Rivers Cattle Company."
The interest in Dave's eyes quickened. "Tate Wallace or Wallace Tate?"
"Tate Wallace. Why?"
"What's he look like?"
"He's a Texan. Tall, slim, over 30, light hair and eyes, and a lazy way."
"I know him," Dave said thinly. How'd he do it?
He and his men just rode in and burned our line camps and drove our riders off and shoved the stock back. All we have now is the house. We fought, but there were too many of them. When the sheriff visited them, they showed him the deed of sale from Dad. Now Dad's taking it to court, but it won't do any good.
Why won't it? Dave asked softly.
They've got the fake witness to the deed, a liar named Sholto, under heavy guard. They're bringing him through here tomorrow on the way to Sabinal, where they'll take him by train to Santa Fe for the suit. We're on our way now, too.
What did you want me for? Dave asked. Carol blushed, but she looked him straight in the eye.
You won't like this, Dave, but you told me you were a gunman. Everybody says you were. I wanted you to come up and drive the Three Rivers outfit off our range.
That's all right, Dave said tonelessly. I would have too.
But it's too late now. The message took so long to reach you. And in between, the deed came to light and Dad filed suit.
She paused.
Now do you see? You can't help.
Dave lounged erect from the door and walked into the middle of the room, his hands on his hips. His face was alert, still curious. You think you told me into a trap and you're sorry, he said quietly. Forget it. They can't take me and they can't hold me and they can't kill me, so quit worrying. I want some questions answered.
But
will you answer them, or do I have to go down to the hall and ask your dad at the point of a gun? Carol stared at him, and she knew he meant it, and she said quickly,
I'll answer them, only please hurry.
Dave grinned faintly, arrogantly, and said, 1. They must claim they paid your dad something for the land, did they?
They've got a forged receipt to prove it, and they did.
Dave scowled. I don't get it.
Last month, our foreman quit, walked out. After he'd gone, we found he had deposited $8,000 in the bank in Dad's name. We didn't know why. When we found that the Three Rivers outfit had shown Sheriff Beale a receipt signed by Dad for $10,000, we knew where the money came from. The Three Rivers outfit had bribed Sam, our foreman, to deposit the money in Dad's name and leave, disappear. They claimed naturally that they paid the money over to Dad, and Dad gave it to Sam to deposit. They also claimed Sam kept $2,000 of the $10,000 and jumped the country. Your dad's signature, Dave said. It's on the deed and on the receipt. What about it? Well, Dad had a fall from a horse 2 months ago that crushed his hand. It's still stiff. His writing isn't like it was. It's like a child's. They knew that. They could imitate it, and they did.
And the foreman, Dave said. Is he gone?
Disappeared. He sailed for South America, Carol said briefly. She hesitated a moment, then said, You see how hopeless it is. We're losing a range that would be a bargain at $100,000, but we can't win. Not even with the lawyer Dad's got.
Who?
Senator Maitland, Dad's oldest friend. He's the best lawyer in the territory, Dave, but he says we haven't an even chance, and what could you do that he can't?
Dave said, Go to bed. When Carol's face flushed and she came to her feet, indignant at his rudeness, he added, Somebody may poke a gun through that window any minute. I don't want you hurt.
Then you're going, Dave?
No.
But...
Go to bed, Dave repeated. Carol walked to the door and Dave opened it for her. Carol paused and turned to him, a kind of hurt pride fighting with the friendliness in her face.
Dave, you were good to come. I didn't have any claim on your friendship. I was, well, just an acquaintance to you. But, see, you can't help. The time for fighting is over. I'm sorry you came up here. I'm sorry about the letter. It's just, well, goodbye.
She put out her hand. Dave took it. Good night.
Goodbye.
Good night, I said.
But...
Gently, Dave placed his hand in the middle of her back and pushed her out the door and closed it. He leaned against it, listening. Presently, he heard something like a sigh and the sound of footsteps retreated down the hall. He didn't leave the door, only moved to one side of it and waited. The knock he seemed certain was coming finally did. Dave said, Walk in, Will. The door opened and a man walked into the room. He was a moose of a man, dressed in a black broadcloth suit that bulged at the shoulders. He had his hands raised far above his head, and he didn't turn his head, only stopped in the middle of the room. I'll take your word for it, Will, Dave murmured. You smell money. Put him down. Will Usher let his hands sink to his sides and slowly turned around. He had the face of a Roman senator, the high, noble forehead, the wide-spaced and clean-looking blue eyes, the firm, wide jaw, the well-shaped mouth, and a shock of beautiful iron-gray curls which he parted on the side. He was smiling now, and his teeth were white and even and strong. Standing there waiting for Dave to speak, he was every inch the high-born intellectual aristocrat. But there was a flaw to his appearance, a flaw that he couldn't hide. His hands were not the long-fingered white hands of an aristocrat. They were the hands of a butcher, big, red, with thick fingers that were all approximately the same size. They were huge and hideous stranger's hands, and even the soft buckskin gloves he affected could not hide them. Dave said softly, "You don't mind taking a chance, do you, Will?" "You won't shoot me," Will Usher said confidently. "We need each other." "The only thing I need you for is a target."
"Don't take that kidnapping so hard, Dave. A man has to make a living."
"It drove me to Mexico, Will," Dave purred. "I don't love any man for that."
"That wasn't me. That was the—"
"Careful," Dave murmured. They eyed each other a moment, and not like two dogs. It was more like two cats. In Dave Coyle's face was wary contempt, a careful, watchful disgust. In Will Usher's face, beneath the handsomeness of it, was the still fear of a man walking on dynamite. Dave said, "Let's hear it."
"Can I sit down? This'll take some time."
"No."
"All right, that McPhee girl has—"
Dave held up his hand, and Usher ceased talking. Presently the sound of slow footsteps sounded in the hall. They came up to the door, paused, and there was a loud knock on the door. Dave looked wickedly at Usher. Usher shook his head and shrugged his shoulders, denying any knowledge of who it was. Dave pointed to him, then pointed to the corner of the room against the front wall. Silently, Usher tiptoed over to the corner and hugged the wall. Dave twisted the knob and pulled the door open. He confronted a truculent-looking old man who had his hand raised to knock again. "I heard you," Dave said arrogantly.
"Look here, young feller," the old man said. "You didn't register."
"You were out hilling around."
"I was out."
The old man paused and peered closely at Dave. Then he licked his lips and took a step backward.
"Ain't you—"
he began, and his voice died. He tried again weakly.
"Ain't you Dave Coyle?"
"Yes." For a moment the old man was confounded. He started to speak and couldn't, and only stared. Then he said sharply,
"You can't stay here."
"Throw me out," Dave invited.
"Get out of here."
"No." The old man backed away and then raised a finger and shook it at him.
"My gummy, I'll get you out."
He turned and almost ran down the hall. Dave closed the door. Usher said dryly,
"You better move quick, Dave."
Dave walked over to the bed and ripped off the blankets. He pulled off a sheet, and while he was tying it to the bed frame, he said, "Take that other sheet and tie it to this one." Usher moved swiftly, too. When the two sheets were tied together, Dave said, "Open the window." While Usher did, Dave shoved the bed over against it and then unrolled the two sheets out the window. To anyone entering the room, it would be a case of simple escape out the window. Dave said, "Where's your room?"
"Down the hall."
"Let's go there." Usher led the way to it. Dave went in last and closed the door behind him and put his back to it. There was the sound of voices suddenly welling in the hall, and then the heavy tramping of many feet. They pounded past the door and then stopped abruptly. Dave heard a man's voice saying,
"I ain't going in there first. It's your job, Sheriff."
"Dave Coyle!" somebody called. "Come out of there! You're surrounded!" No answer. Then there was a long period of silence, and suddenly a man bawled, "He's went out through the window!" Somebody shot. Again there was a savage pounding of feet in the hall, and then it died as the crowd hit the stairs. Dave looked at Will Usher, who was standing by the bed. "Make your deal," he said.
"That girl must have told you about—"
"She told me. What about it?"
"Don't get red-headed at this next, Dave. I'm only asking. Do you like her? Do you want to help her?"
Dave, his gray eyes a little narrowed, said, "I want to help her, yes."
"And earn a 50-50 split on $50,000?
Dave said quietly. "Does it stink?"
"It's clean,"
Usher protested.
"Cleanest money I ever made."
"It could still stink. What is it?"
"Look, the Three Rivers outfit is bringing that witness Sholto through here tomorrow and taking him to the railroad in Sabinal. Now—"
"How do you know that?"
"It's in the papers,"
Usher protested.
"Anybody can read it."
"All right, go on." Usher grinned.
"Well, don't you know now?"
"Sure I do. Kidnap him and let the Three Rivers outfit buy him back for $50,000. Usher nodded, spread his palms, and smiled.
"Simple, eh? And clean. They're a bunch of pirates. They're running a pretty cagey Sandy on Bruce McPhee, and it's sewed up tight. But they need that witness. They're getting away with a $125,000 steal. They need Sholto, and they'll pay $50,000 to get him back."
Dave nodded and said softly, "Why ring me in on it? $50,000 is more than 25. Why split it?" Usher shook his head and raised both hands, palms out.
Not me, Dave. I couldn't swing it. I'll take a 50-50 chance anytime, and lots of times I'll take a 60-40 chance. But I don't like those 90-10 odds. You do.
Dave didn't say anything, only looked at Usher, and finally Usher said,
Well,
got any ideas?
I've got a beauty. It's risky. Outside of that horse-faced Wallace and his Three Rivers crew, there'll be a deputy U.S. Marshal and Sheriff Beale and however many deputies he wants guarding Sholto and the train. Now that you're in the country, Bill will probably double the guard. That's the risk. Now here's the plan.
He told him, and Dave listened critically. When Usher was finished, Dave said, All right, I'll take 30,000. You take 20 when we get the ransom money.
Wait a...
Take it or leave it. Usher glared at him for a moment, then shrugged.
All right, it's a deal.
Light a rag, then, Dave said coldly.
What?
Get out. A moose. Drag it. Light a shuck. Hit the grit. Get out of here, Dave murmured.
But this is my room. I sleep.
Dave opened the door and stood aside. Usher glanced around the room, his handsome face sullen, picked up 3 cigars off the dresser, and put them in his breast pocket. He said,
You sure you know what you're going to do, Dave?
I'm going to kick you out of this room in about 3 seconds, Dave said coldly. Usher hurried past him and went out, saying good night. Dave didn't answer him. He blew out the lamp, then lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Will Usher's plan was good as far as it went. It would get the money, but as soon as Sholto was back in Wallace's hands, there was the same threat to McPhee. The thing to do, of course, was to keep Sholto away from Wallace for good. But if he did that, Wallace would claim that McPhee and Dave Coyle were in partnership, and McPhee would be prosecuted. No, he must help McPhee and make it look as if he were helping only himself. And this was a start, small as it was. He wondered, suddenly, why he had ridden 600 miles and put a noose around his neck just to help a girl who had once ridden on a stage with him. He guessed it was because she needed him. Other women before had needed him. Honky-tonk girls, outlaws women, little Mexican cantina girls. But never a girl like Carol McPhee. Of course, she had only wanted his gun prowess, but that was something. She was something. Nice, strange, a lady. And some stubborn desire within him made him want to show her that he could be a friend to a lady too. He went to sleep in Usher's bed, while outside in the night, the sheriff's crowd was cautiously beating the alleys, looking for him. End of chapter 2. Section 3 of Hard Case by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Sabinal, 10 miles from Yellow Jacket, had an almost festive air today. It wasn't the kind of bright gaiety that is seen during a fiesta when all the country people come in to drink and dance because their crops are in. It was a townsman's festivity, when hot black suits are donned, ties are worn, vest pockets stocked with cigars, and pants pockets are filled with $50 to buy drinks. It was a politician's holiday, for wasn't Sheriff Beale and a posse bringing Sholto, the Three Rivers star witness, to the train? All the arrangements had been made at the Sabinal house to take over the dining room for the noon meal and the front suite afterward while they waited for the train to come in at 3 o'clock. Votes would be swapped, a lot of whiskey drunk, and enough speculation on the coming court fight. McPhee versus the Three Rivers Cattle Company to fill volumes. This was history-making, for McPhee had come into the country 20 years ago a hard-headed and penniless Scot, and he had succeeded, with a born cattleman's savvy in building up a tidy empire, making a host of enemies and dumping along the way somewhere a troublesome partner who had first put up the money to start them. Few people liked him, but everyone had respect for him, for his ruthlessness and his success. The Three Rivers outfit, headed by Tate Wallace, had set up shop next to McPhee's range. They had fought in and out of court and in and out of 3 towns that bounded their range, but this was the first time it was ever intimated that it was going to be a fight to the death. Wallace claimed McPhee, seeing he would be beaten, sold out to Three Rivers, and he had a deed to prove it. McPhee claimed he had never signed the deed. One of them was lying. If McPhee won his suit, Tate Wallace would be in jail for many years. Most people hoped and thought Wallace would win it, and in that case McPhee was ruined. It excited people, and they milled around the streets waiting for a sign of Beale's posse. Already 2 extra deputy marshals were lounging in the hotel, ready to swell the number of official guards offering safe conduct to the witness. The crowd was concentrated on the main street, for it was certain that Beale, good politician that he was, would give the townspeople a parade. The back street next to the railroad track was naturally deserted, and it was down this rutted street around noon that a team and wagon appeared. The team was a sorry-looking crowbait pair with their harness patched with rope. The wagon, its wheels atilt, was covered by a rotted canvas on hoops and was driven by a shabby Mexican in bib overalls. The wagon pulled up beside the railroad station, whose red paint was sun-blistered and peeled, and the Mexican dismounted. He glanced about him with some bewilderment, circled the place once, then walked up to the yawning door of the freight warehouse and took off his hat and stood there. The men were lounging inside, one sitting on the scales and smoking a pipe, the other sitting on a box crate. Presently, the man with the pipe caught sight of the Mexican, and he called, "What you want, amigo?" The Mexican smiled and said something in Spanish, and the man with the pipe said to his companion, "Come along, Joe, I don't savvy his gab." The two men walked over to the Mexican, and Joe said, "Como?" The Mexican started to speak then in slow, measured tones. When he finished, Joe said to the freight agent, "His father died last night. He wants us to ship the body to Socorro for him on the train." The freight agent looked skeptical. "He does he? Tell him it costs money for that." Joe told the Mexican. The Mexican answered, and Joe told the agent, "He says he's got money." "I bet he ain't got enough for that. Tell him it will be $24. A sudden pity crossed the agent's face. "Ask him why he doesn't bury him here and save the money." Joe talked again. Presently he told the agent, "He says he's got $25. He says all the Ocoas since De Vargas have been buried in Socorro, and that's their home. I reckon he just wants to do it." "All right," the agent said gently. "I hate to take his money, though." The Mexican spoke again, and Joe translated. "He wants to know if it will go fast." "Tell him express, as fast as we can send it." The three of them went out to the wagon then. A plain pine box, a cross burned in its top, rested in the wagon bed, and when the two men saw it, they removed their hats. The three of them stumbled up the platform with the box and into the freight warehouse, where it was deposited in an empty corner. They went up to the office. The Mexican paid and left. The agent, watching his stooped figure disappear, shook his head and said, "Think of it, Joe. That poor old Jasper has worked 15 years saving this money, and now he spends it all to get the old man back to his burying place." "It's tough," Joe said. A little before noon, Sheriff Beale's posse arrived. At first glance, it seemed a well-equipped army, with everyone carrying rifles and sidearms. Tate Wallace, the Three Rivers foreman, was a shrewd man, and he knew that in putting up a howl for protection of his witness, he was playing to Sheriff Beale's vanity. Beale had been more than glad to demonstrate that no witness in his county could come to harm. Bruce McPhee, from the upper story room of the Sabinal house, which had taken in order to have some place for his daughter to rest after the ride from Yellow Jacket, looked down on Sheriff Beale's entry. Carol, watching him from the bed, saw his face settle into grim lines. It was a rugged, craggy, overproud face, the face of a domineering man just in his prime. There was bigotry and hardness in his eyes, too, and a kind of simmering rage that had been there since this affair. He affected the plain black suit and expensive boots of a prosperous cattleman, but it had been his boast once that he could top any horse or rope any steer that wore his brand. The trouble was, people said, he rode and hog-tied men with the same ruthless manner, and they had seen many instances to back up this belief. There was, for instance, the reward he slapped on Dave Coyle for saving his daughter from Will Usher's wild bunch. Also, there was that business about his old partner, Lacey Thornton. When Thornton and McPhee, after a decade of killing work, had finally begun to make money, Thornton began to drink. Not much for that time and that day, but enough. Bruce McPhee warned him, and when the warning wasn't taken, he kicked him out of the partnership. Thornton claimed in public and out that McPhee got him drunk and had him sign the release, a release which left Thornton very little money. McPhee never bothered to answer him. His stocky body, overlaid now with a little fat, was somehow indomitable looking. His right hand, which he favored since the fall, hung stiffly at the seam of his trousers, and the fingers twitched now with anger as he looked down at the street. His face was stiff with a cold, hating anger. It was this anger that Carol saw now, and she said, "You knew it was going to happen, Dad. Don't get mad again." Her father turned to her and pointed a stubby finger at the street. "But damn it, don't you see what kind of a cheap insult it is? That damn play acting out there. It's telling the whole world I'd kill Sholto if I got a chance." "Wouldn't you?" Carol asked. McPhee's face got red and he started to speak. Then his eyes became reflective for a moment, and presently he smiled. Why, yes, I reckon I would. The lying, robbing, perjuring tin-horn. I hadn't thought of that. There was a knock on the door, and Carol went over to open it. She stepped aside to let in Senator Maitland, McPhee's lawyer. He smiled at Carol and shook hands with McPhee. He was an almost bald man, stocky as McPhee, with the kindly and benign face of an overworked country doctor. His movements were deliberate, his speech slow, but under his almost bumbling and pompous demeanor was hidden the keenest legal brain in the territory. He wore a claw-hammer coat, white ruffled shirt, and black string tie, the indispensable uniform of the politician. His eyes were almost hidden in their deep sockets behind hooded lids. There was a simple air of honesty about him that won any man, and he had remained poor in the service of the people of the territory.
"Well, Sheriff Beale is playing it the politician's way, Bruce," he murmured. "See the parade?"
Looked before I start with that kind of stuff," McPhee growled.
"Oh, I wouldn't say that,"
Maitland murmured. He put his arm around Carol and gave her a fatherly hug.
"Can't you cheer him up, girl?"
Carol smiled sadly.
"I'm afraid there's not much to be cheerful about."
Maitland shook his head.
"That's a fact."
He sighed.
"Well, we aren't beaten yet. There are a few tricks in court, I know, that will have them guessing."
He looked at McPhee's gloomy countenance and smiled.
"You might as well get ready for another jolt."
McPhee looked puzzled, and Maitland went on.
"Lacey Thornton is downstairs waiting for an interview with you. He insists that he doesn't want a quarrel, but only wants an interview with you for that newspaper of his. He says the Clarion will print lies if it doesn't get the truth, so he wants you to give him the truth."
"Since when did he ever give me justice in the Clarion?" McPhee growled. "Tell him I'll see him in hell first."
Maitland shook his head. "You'll need all the public support you can get, Bruce. You can't keep the habit of a top dog anymore. Can't afford it. Go down there and hold your temper and tell him the truth."
"Do I have to?" Maitland smiled gently.
"Well, it's your lawyer's advice."
The three of them went downstairs, but not until after Maitland had taken the precaution of removing McPhee's gun from the holster and putting it on the dresser. The lobby was cleared of people, most of whom had stepped out into the street to watch Beale's parade. Only one man remained, and he rose as he saw the three of them coming down the stairs. Lacey Thornton, editor of the Sabinal Clarion, was a little terrier of a man, small, wiry, nervous, with a face that had a seasoned whiskey flush in its wizened monkey's features. 10 feet from him, his aura of good bourbon whiskey was unmistakable. He had been drinking today, Carol could see, as he came up to them. He touched his hat to her, and McPhee said coldly to his ex-partner, "You wanted to interview me?"
"That's right," Thornton said impudently. "How do you feel? Wait until I get my notebook."
He drew out a sheaf of notebook paper, licked a pencil, and said again,
"How do you feel?"
"Confident," McPhee said coldly.
"He feels confident,"
Thornton murmured dryly as he wrote. Then he looked up and said,
"Has your blood pressure increased?"
Maitland said gently,
"There'll be no baiting, Lacey. An interview, yes, but no persecution."
Thornton made a mock bow to Maitland and said,
"Only doing my duty, Senator."
To McPhee, he said,
"How's it feel to hold the dirty end of the stick for once, Mr. McPhee?"
"Let's go," McPhee said curtly to Maitland.
"Oh, but my interview," Lacey protested mockingly. "Think of the 310 readers of the Clarion, Mr. McPhee. All of them hope you'll lose every dollar you've ever made, but they want to know how you're taking it. What'll I tell them?"
"Anything you damn well please," McPhee shouted. Lacey murmured as he wrote,
"He's taking it like a bear with a trap on each foot."
He put his notes away and grinned and said,
"Well, that covers it, I reckon, except for an expression of sympathy from the Clarion."
Carol said,
"Sympathy?" "Yes, miss,"
Lacey drawled.
"Sympathy. The Clarion extends sympathy to Mr. McPhee,"
he said mockingly.
"We are all sorry, terribly sorry, that my esteemed ex-partner is going to lose his money. We all hoped he'd lose his life instead."
With a growl of rage, McPhee started for Thornton. Maitland grabbed his arms and held him. Lacey Thornton didn't move. He only stood there, the light of the devil in his eyes.
"Man alive," he murmured. "I'd just as soon die next week. I've lived to see everything in this life I wanted to see."
He snapped his fingers in McPhee's face.
"When you're broke, come round to the Clarion, and I'll give you 2 bits for a drink. And I hope it'll choke you."
He laughed and walked into the dining room, not even looking back. At that moment, the lobby door swung open and Tate Wallace stepped inside. When he saw McPhee, he stopped dead. He was a tall man, pale-haired, bleach-eyed Texan with a long, bony face and the easygoing, long-legged grace and spare movements of a man who had learned to be quick and swift-moving only in emergencies. He paused in mid-stride as he saw the three of them, and then he turned and called over his shoulder, "Hard Sholto, boys, here's McPhee." There was a small commotion outside the door, and Beale stepped through, his gun drawn. He had the air of a courteous watchdog as he gallantly doffed his hat to Carroll and pointed the gun at them with the other hand. McPhee spat contemptuously in Wallace's direction and stalked on through the lobby into the dining room, Maitland with Carroll following. There was a gleam of inner amusement in Wallace's eye as they retreated, and then it vanished and his face was sober as he turned to Beale. "Much obliged, Sheriff." He looked pretty salty. "Don't you worry none, Tate. We'll take care of you," Bill said in his professionally hearty voice. Once inside the dining room, McPhee, Carroll, and Senator Maitland took a table for three by the window and ordered their meal. Before it was served, the posse filed into the dining room and sat at the long table provided for them in the center of the room. Sholto was ostentatiously seated in a chair where he was hidden, save for his head, by the bodies of the posse members. Carroll and McPhee, since this was the first time they had seen the man who was supposed to have witnessed the signing of the famous deed, stared at him. It was this man who held their fate in his hands, for without him to swear he had witnessed the transaction, Maitland could prove that any child could forge McPhee's signature. Carroll's first thought was that he looked angry. He was thin, gaunt-cheeked, burned to a saddle color except for his forehead, which had a band of lighter flesh beneath the hairline where his hat had shaded him. Against her will, she liked his face. It was melancholy, reserved, almost austere, and for one fleeting moment Carroll wondered if her father had signed the deed and forgotten it. This man Sholto didn't look like a professional liar. Sheriff Beale sat on Sholto's right, and he kept his eyes on McPhee. The old boy wouldn't give him any trouble, he knew, but it wouldn't hurt to pretend he would. He was still watching McPhee and Maitland, almost glaring at them, when a man stepped in between his chair and Tate Wallace's, who was seated on his right. It was Ernie C., his plain face preoccupied.
"Harv, I just ran into something funny. You remember old Beatty's horse that was reported stolen out of the feed corral this morning in Yellow Jacket?"
Bill nodded, knowing in his bones what was coming.
"Well, I just seen him in the corral down the street."
He and Beale looked at each other a long quiet moment, and then Tate Wallace, who had overheard Ernie, said, "Here, in Sabinal?" Again, Ernie nodded. Wallace put it into words, drawling angrily. "Well, Sheriff, it only goes to prove what I've been trying to tell you. Box 73 at Wagon Mound is Bruce McPhee's box. McPhee and Dave Coyle was in Yellow Jacket last night. Dave Coyle never owned a horse in his life. He steals them whenever he wants to move. A horse is stolen in Yellow Jacket this morning, and it turns up in Sabinal this noon." Sheriff Beale murmured, "God almighty," and groaned. Tate Wallace shoved his chair back and stood up and walked around to the table to face McPhee. Sheriff Beale was at his heels, watching him anxiously. "So you've thrown in with an outlaw now, have you, McPhee?" Wallace demanded. McPhee's surprise was greater than his anger as he came to his feet. "What outlaw?" "Dave Coyle. He's in town. What's that got to do with me?" "You wrote him to meet you in Yellow Jacket," Wallace said hotly. "You talked to him last night." Maitland said sternly, "Watch your language, Wallace, or I'll slap a libel suit on you to boot." McPhee didn't even hear his lawyer. He said angrily to Wallace, "You're a liar on 2 counts." His napkin was balled up in his fist.
Gentlemen, Senator Maitland said, "remember where we are." "I'm telling you something, McPhee," Wallace said savagely. "You're traveling on the same train as we are this afternoon. We're taking Sholto in the baggage car, and if I lay eyes on you or Coyle in that baggage car, I'll gun you like the damn double-crossing dog you are."
McPhee hit him then. He moved quickly, hotly, and there was a lot of solid weight behind the blow. Wallace walked backwards off balance until he was brought up against a chair, and then he sat down abruptly on the floor. For a half-second he was immobile, and then his hand streaked for his gun. Sheriff Beale dived at him, and so did the man in the chair beside him. They caught him just as the gun was clearing leather, and there was a swift moment of grunting and wrestling, and finally Beale rose with the gun. Wallace came swiftly to his feet. His face was pale with anger and little lights danced wickedly in his bleach eyes. There was no inner amusement in them this time as he glared at McPhee. His raw hiding had turned on him and he didn't like it. He said softly, "I'll ruin you for that, McPhee. And if I don't ruin you, I'll kill you." He turned and stalked out of the dining room and Bill followed him out. The members of the Three Rivers crew closest to their boss got up and followed Beale. McPhee, under the disturbed gaze of Carol and Maitland, who had said nothing during the fight, sat down and picked up his fork. He saw Lacey Thornton writing industriously at another table. He stabbed at some food and then slammed the fork down. He was murdering mad and there was no use trying to hide it.
"Eat, Papa,"
Carol said weakly. "Eat hell," McPhee roared. "I'm going up and get a gun and kill that curly wolf." The whole dining room heard him. He got out of his chair so abruptly that he tipped over the water pitcher and stalked out of the dining room. Carol and Maitland, a worried look on his face, followed him upstairs. Already a pair of deputy marshals stood undecided in the door to the dining room watching them. Lacey Thornton stood beside them laughing. In the room, Carol grabbed hold of her father's shirt and beat his chest with her small fists. Maitland stood between McPhee and the gun on the dresser.
Dad, they'll murder you," Carol cried. "Think a minute, think."
"Well, I've thought too long," McPhee growled. "I'm going to get it over with."
"And what will happen to Carol, Bruce?" Maitland said gently. "Think of that if you won't about killing a man."
It was that question that hauled McPhee up. He stared at Maitland like a man coming out of a trance, but there was still fight in him. "Damn it, the gall of that damn pirate!" he roared. "Me throwing him with that cutthroat of a Dave Coyle when I put up $3,000 for his dead or alive reward. And now I'm supposed to be working for him."
I know,
Maitland said gently. McPhee was shouting now, and Carol knew that when he did that, the worst was over. Now all she had to say was, "Yes, Papa," to everything he said, and he'd calm down eventually. He stalked to the window now and glared out as if he were trying to blacken the fall sun. Senator Maitland looked at her, smiled faintly, and shook his head. Carol smiled back weakly. She was thinking of Wallace's accusation. Did they know she had talked to Dave Coyle last night? If her father found that out, he would disown her. If Dave would only keep out of it. He couldn't butt in now, after what she had told him last night. But behind that thought was a creeping fear that he would. He was in town because just before Wallace had come over to their table, she had seen the expression on Sheriff Beale's face.
"Oh, Lord," she prayed, "get us out of here without Dave Coyle doing anything."
The celebration had died like a wet firecracker. In the hotel and on the street, the word went around that Dave Coyle was in town. Nobody knew where he was, but the straight of it was that he was helping McPhee. And since the best way to help McPhee was to kill Sholto, everybody was uneasy. And Beale, who had counted on passing out cigars and drinks and reminding people what a good sheriff they had, was most uneasy of all. He proclaimed an immediate search of the hotel. He put a guard at McPhee's door and one at Wallace's door. In Sholto's room, he put around a dozen of his most trusted men. As for himself, he paced the lobby among the silent members of his posse. They were all recalling stories of Dave Coyle, how the very morning after the night the U.S. Commissioner had raised the reward ante on him from $3,000 to $5,000, Dave Coyle had begged a handout breakfast from the Commissioner's cook. While the Commissioner ate in the dining room with his wife, Dave Coyle had eaten at the kitchen table. Finished, he had thanked the cook, walked into the dining room and thanked the Commissioner and his wife, and had gone out the front door. It was stories like that worried a man and made him jumpy. The hours from 1 till 3 were the tough ones. If he could weather them, Sheriff Beale thought he would be safe, for Sholto would be on the train then. And nothing short of dynamiting a bridge would keep Sholto from reaching Santa Fe. At 2:30, he sent a man down to see if the train was on time and with orders that it wasn't to leave until his party had boarded it. At 10 minutes to 3, McPhee, Carol, and Maitland came down the stairs, paid their bill in silence, and walked out. At 5 minutes to 3, when he heard the train whistle, Beale sent word up to Wallace and Sholto. The best plan was, he reflected, to put Sholto in the middle of the whole mob of men and walk down to the station, keeping an eye on second-story windows. They left the hotel about 3 and started the block's walk down to the tracks, and every man there had a gun in his hand and every second-story window was suspect. The crowd on the station platform was cleared off ahead of time so that the platform was empty, except for the freight agent and his helper and the baggage truck. One truck, the contents of which were to be loaded, stood off to one side, while the other truck was being loaded at the open door of the baggage car. Bill glanced cursorily at the car, then stationed his men at 6-foot intervals along the station platform, facing the crowd of townspeople gaping at the whole business. The unloading was finished, and the loading began. The coffin was the biggest piece of freight on the truck. The black cross burned into its top with a hot iron in the shape of it told the curious what it was, although there were few curious about it now. The crowd was nervous, and there was no talk. If the break came, it would come now. The coffin was taken in and placed on the floor in a corner of the 7th car. The rest of the freight and mail was loaded swiftly, and then Sholto, who had been standing in a group inside the warehouse, was hustled out and into the car. 20 picked men surrounded him and followed him into the baggage car. Sheriff Beale stepped in last. He waved to the train crew, smiled at the crowd outside, and closed the door. The train pulled out, and back in the coach, Carol McPhee drew the first easy breath in 3 hours. Inside the baggage car, Beale sat down on the nearest piece of freight and mopped his face with a handkerchief. Nobody would ever know what a relief it was to get that door closed and the train moving. He said to Tate Wallace, "Are those doors locked?" Tate grinned. "Both the end doors and the side doors. You ain't nervous, are you, Bill?" "I am," Bill said. "I'll be nervous until we get over the grade and out of Yellow Jacket County." Wallace sneered. "Dave Coyle may take chances, but not them kind of chances. The only way he could stop us now is by blowing up the train." "He won't do that," Ernie C. said dryly. "McPhee's on the train." Bill shook his head doubtfully and looked at Sholto, who was sitting with his back to the mail racks, where the clerks were sorting out the mail. The other men were scattered in the back end of the car, their rifles leaned against the wall. If Beale was scared, they were not, for they were talking and joking among themselves, conversing with the 2 deputy marshals. Bill said to Sholto, "You never come closer to having a bullet in your back." Sholto's face didn't change, didn't show any signs of fear. He said quietly, "I never heard of Dave Coyle shooting a man in the back, and I don't believe it." Tate said meagerly, "Nobody's asking you to believe it, Jim. You just listen." Sholto looked up at Wallace, and for a moment a quiet, wicked hatred crept into his eyes. Then it died, and he said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Wallace." Once out of Sabinal, the train started to pull up the long grade of the high ridges that spread in a series of half-circles around Sabinal to the north. The steady, labored breathing of the locomotive could be heard distinctly, and the grade slowed the train's speed. The whole crew had relaxed now and were lounging about the car. Somebody said, "I got some cards," and immediately a poker game started on the floor of the car. It was only a matter of minutes before a half-dozen of them, seated in a circle on the floor of the car, were playing. The others, with the danger past, relaxed and stood or squatted behind them and watched the progress of the initial hand of stud. Sheriff Beale and Sholto both stood up and watched. The mail clerks, their backs to the game, stuck to their business of sorting out the mail. One of the deputy marshals with aces back-to-back turned over his hole card, grinned, and said, "My pot, boys." At that same instant, Sheriff Beale felt something hard bore into his spine, and a soft voice murmured, "Wrong, boys. It's my pot." End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Hard Case by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Every man in the baggage car looked up then. Standing behind and to one side of Sheriff Beale and holding a gun in the sheriff's back stood Dave Coyle. There was a cold, jeering light in his eyes. His twisted smile was faint. He looked utterly relaxed and careless, but in his eyes was that unblinking watchfulness that kept every man there immobile. Dave said, "Sholto, step back beside me." As he spoke, he slipped the sheriff's gun out of its holster, cocked it, and took a step backward. Sholto, hands half raised, stepped back beside Dave. Slowly, a deputy marshal put his hands on the floor in readiness to push himself up. "Quit it," Dave said mildly. The man sank down on the floor again. Dave said, "Sheriff, gather up those guns. Don't miss any or I'm liable to get mad. Take an empty mail sack." Beale, his face ashen, took one of the empty mail sacks on the rack and started collecting the guns. The only sound in the car was the clackety-clack of the wheels. Most of these men, for the first time, were beholding Dave Coyle in the flesh, and they did not like what they saw. He stood there, a sneer on his face, cocky, arrogant, his eyes jeering. His glance finally settled on Wallace, who was watching him warily. They observed each other a long moment, and then Dave said, "You've come a long way since I saw you last." Wallace frowned in puzzlement. "Well, I don't get it," he said carefully. Dave said, "You get it all right. 2 years ago in Dodge, you were a tin horn named Wallace Tate, a big wind from Texas. What's your name now?" Tate Wallace's long face turned a shade darker. He said, "Tate Wallace." "Well, well," Dave sneered. All the men in the car now were watching Dave and Wallace. Dave said gently, "And you boss the Three Rivers outfit?" "That's right." "You come a long ways for a tin horn," Dave said. "Just about as far as you're going to come, too." Ernie C. grunted, and Dave looked at him. "What's your trouble?" "You?" Ernie said. Bill stopped shoving guns into the mail sack long enough to look up and say to Ernie, "Be careful, you damn fool." Dave observed Ernie closely. He saw a plain-looking, pleasant-faced young man with outrage in his brown eyes and a stubborn set to his mouth. "Go ahead," he said softly. Ernie said doggedly, "Who do you think you are? You think just because a little killer like you is thrown in with McPhee that the law is going to fold up in this country?" There was a moment's utter silence. Half the men there expected to hear a gun go off, and Ernie C. would have paid for his rashness. Dave only sneered. "You simple jughead. Would I help a stuffed Stetson like McPhee that's put a price on my head?" "Then what are you doing now?" Ernie said hotly. Dave glanced at Wallace and said coldly, "You tell him." "I don't know," Wallace said. "If you want Sholto back, buy him back," Dave sneered. He looked at Ernie. "That suits you?" Ernie didn't say anything. Beale was finished gathering up the guns now. Dave tilted his head toward the door. "Throw them out. Leave the door open." Bill pulled the big door back and dumped the sack of guns out the door, then stepped back among the others. Dave waited a moment, his head cocked as if listening to something. The train was gradually picking up speed now, and he knew that they were on top of the grade, soon to start the long coast down the other side. He said curtly to Sholto, "Stand in that door. When you see the horses, jump." There was a moment of waiting, during which Sholto peered out the door up the tracks. Ernie C. suddenly blurted out, "How'd you get in here, Coyle?" "I got mailed in a letter," Dave jeered. There was another moment's wait, and then Sholto said, "I see them. Jump." Sholto did, and then Dave walked over to the door. The sitting men came to their feet then, and Dave knew they were aching to rush him. "Anybody feel froggy?" he taunted. Ernie C. said hotly, "You hurt Sholto and we'll hang you by your thumbs, Coyle." "Boo," Dave sneered. He looked at Tate Wallace. "Get some cash on hand for me." Then he leaped through the open door. He hit soft sand, fell, rolled over and over, and came to his feet about 10 yards from the train. The coach trailed past, and he saw Carol McPhee at the window. She saw him, and for one instant there was surprise and fright on her face. Dave was too wise to wave at her, for other people were watching. He only smiled faintly, and then the coach rattled past. He looked down the right-of-way and saw Sholto trudging toward him. The train ran on down the grade, gathering momentum each 100 yards. It would take a good 5 miles before it reached the bottom of the grade and could stop, and even then the posse would be without guns or horses. Sholto came up to him. Dave stood there, hands on hips, observing the man whose perjury was going to ruin Carol McPhee and her father. His inspection of him on the train had only been cursory, but he had been surprised then. He was even more surprised as he regarded him now. He had expected to find a shifty-eyed rat who would come crawling to him for mercy, but Sholto looked like a leaned-down and broke puncher. His gaze didn't falter as he came to halt in front of Dave. Dave said dryly, "Ain't you gonna thank me?" "No," Sholto said quietly. "That's funny," Dave drawled. "From that coughing back there on the train, you didn't sound like you liked Wallace much." Sholto said nothing, and Dave scowled. "Want to ride off alone?" he asked presently. Sholto shrugged. "Suit yourself." "Where'll you go if I turn you loose?" "Back to Wallace." Dave, frowning faintly, jerked his head toward the horses. "Well, you're not riding off alone." Dave walked a little behind him, frowning faintly, trying to figure out this man. He didn't look like a crook, and a moment ago Dave would have bet that Sholto was glad to be away from Wallace. but there was a spiritless resignation in the man now that had Dave troubled. When they were almost up the 2 horses tied at the edge of the cedar scrub, Will Usher rode into the clearing and waited for them. He was smiling broadly as they came up. "Have any trouble?" "No," Dave said. "Did you stay hid?" Usher laughed and eyed Sholto hungrily.
"Trust me, I've got to find Wallace and collect the cash, don't I?"
"Go do it," Dave ordered. Usher pulled his horse around and called over his shoulder.
"I'll be at the lion camp in 2 days."
Dave didn't even answer. He took the nearest horse, stepped into the saddle, and regarded Sholto. "I don't savvy just how slippery you are yet, Sholto. Suppose you go lead off." He nodded toward the near blue bulk of the Corazon Range to the west. "We're going over there. Keep to the rocky country and the streams, and try to cover your sign." Sholto led off without a word, and Dave rode behind, watching him. He had taken Carol McPhee's story of the forged deed in utter good faith, but now he knew a moment of doubt. This man wasn't a crook, yet he seemed eager to testify against McPhee. It almost looked as if Sholto had really witnessed McPhee's signature and was only interested in seeing justice done. Dave put that out of his mind and observed the man's actions, his clothes, his mannerisms. He could tell from the way Sholto took advantage of the country that he had either been a lawman or an outlaw. He was smart at hiding his sign and fast at it too. They continued toward the Corazon the rest of the afternoon, and when dusk finally came, when they were crossing a narrow stream, Dave called a halt. They dismounted, unloosed the cinches, and let their horses drink. Then Dave brought out some jerky and cold biscuits that Will Usher had provided in the saddlebags, and they wolfed down their supper, squatting by the narrow stream. Finished, Dave took out a sack of tobacco and handed it to Sholto. "Smoke?" Sholto looked surprised, took the tobacco and rolled a cigarette. Dave waited until he inhaled, and observing the deep, luxurious mouthful of smoke the man dragged into his lungs, Dave said abruptly, "So, Wallace ain't even going to pay you for lying for him." Sholto looked at him coolly, and before he could speak, Dave said, "Don't bother to lie. I know McPhee never signed the deed, but I didn't figure any man was sucker enough to stick his head out for nothing like you're doing." He could see Sholto's face turn darker in the dusk, and he knew that taunt had struck home, but Sholto kept silent. Dave said abruptly, "How's your wife?" Sholto started so that he dropped the cigarette from his fingers. He picked it up and slowly raised his head to look at Dave. "I'm not married." "You're a liar," Dave said flatly. "You like tobacco, but you don't carry it. I know the pants you're wearing are 2 sizes too big for you, so they was given to you. I see your boots are rotten. You're broke. And if you're broke, it's 'cause Wallace ain't paying you to lie. And if he ain't paying you, it's because he's got something on you. And if he had something on you and was holding you a prisoner, you'd have been begging me the last 4 hours to let you loose. You didn't. That's 'cause you're leaving someone. A wife, mother, or kid, where Wallace can get back at them if you duck out." He added coldly, "How do you like that?" Sholto was trembling a little now, but he said steadily enough, "It's your story." He looked closely at Dave. "Besides, what do you care? You ain't helping McPhee, you said. You're just after money." Dave said, "I don't love Wallace, neither do you." Sholto looked away. "You'll get nothing from me." But Dave had got most of what he wanted. He was sure now that Sholto was being blackmailed by Wallace into perjury. They set out again in the falling dusk, and this time Dave led the way. The Corazons were not really a range, but 2 heavily timbered mountains. With their far-reaching foothills, their rough-timbered slopes, and their rocky shoulders, they bulked as large as many ranges. Their 2 peaks, rounded and regular and matched, would have brought the name Squaw Mountain or Sugarloaf from a Yankee frontiersman seeing them for the first time. But a Spaniard had seen them first, coming on them in late afternoon when the healed-over sun brought out every detail of the canyons. And from the flats far out beyond Sabinal, the twin rounded peaks had seemed to be shaped like the top of a heart. The sun had touched the long slope of the canyons that met at a point in the foothills, and these slopes, taken with the peaks, had carried out the illusion of the heart. So he had named them the Corazon, the heart. It was for the point of this heart that Dave headed in the darkness, keeping to the streams which branched out from it. They climbed hour after hour, the land lifting away from the foothills into the timber and the stream growing smaller. Finally, long after midnight, they came to the mountain meadow that Dave was looking for. It was an old line camp, abandoned these weeks since the herds had been driven down for fall roundup. In a short time, the snows would be here, but now it would be empty. Dave knew these things because he had to, because it was knowledge like this that let him live in camps like this that housed him. They crossed the long meadow and dry grass knee-deep to horses and pulled up in front of the line shack. It was dark, the door closed. Sholto off-saddled in silence and staked out their horses while Dave went behind the shack and picked up some lengths of wood. He came around, kicked the door open, and remembering where the stove was from the last visit, headed toward it in the dark. He found it, laid the fire, found a match, and wiped it alight on his trousers. He touched it to the shavings and watched them begin to burn. Sholto came in behind him and stopped, and Sholto said, "Dave?" He said it in a way that held a warning. Dave whirled, and then his down-sweeping hand was arrested. There, facing him, gun drawn, 5 other men backing him with drawn guns, was Will Usher.
"Well, Dave, my lad," Usher drawled, "you did the job for me, all right."
End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Hardcase by Luke Short. LibriVox recordings in the public domain. Chapter 5. Dave looked at him one brief second, and then his still face, its lips curled in contempt, settled into anger. "Put that thing down," he said softly. Will Usher laughed.
"I'm no woman, Dave. You move so much as a finger, and we'll blow you through that wall."
He meant it, Dave saw. After lighting a candle on the table by Sholto, Usher skirted Sholto and edged closer to Dave, careful to keep himself out of the line of fire of his men. For one desperate second, Dave was tempted to make his play, but the odds were too great and Will Usher knew it. Usher reached out, slipped Dave's gun from its holster, and backed against the wall. He was smiling, his face handsome.
"So this is the payoff,"
he jibed gently.
"Wild Davy Coyle, the man who couldn't be caught."
He laughed softly.
"A sucker's trap. It was so plain you didn't see it, did you?"
Dave sneered, turning his cold eyes on Usher. "Take Sholto and get out of here before I get mad." Usher only grinned, and Dave didn't like it.
"And get only 50,000 when I could get 57,000?
he asked gently. For a moment, Dave was puzzled, and then it came to him. Usher was going to collect 50,000 ransom for Sholto. The 7,000 would be the reward money on him, Dave Coyle, wanted dead or alive. Usher saw that thought sink into Dave's awareness, and he smiled again.
"So you were going to cut off my ears last night, Davy," he drawled. "I'll cut off your ears tonight. That's how I'll collect my bounty."
He looked at Dave. Dave said,
"Well, I thought you were smarter than that." "Then what?"
"Than to try and kill me. Better men than you've tried." Usher's face flushed, and his gun, which had been sagging a little, came up again.
"All I gotta do is pull the trigger."
Dave shook his head. His hands were on his hips, his face arrogant, his feet widespread.
"Sure it is.
But you won't do it now."
"Why won't I?"
"Because you'll want to rub it in first.
You want to see me beg. You'll want to see me sweat and start to shake. That right?"
For a split second, he wasn't sure whether Usher would pull the trigger or not. And then Usher said softly,
"That's right, Davy boy. Maybe you better start begging now."
Dave had not had time to put the lid of the stove on, and now the fire was burning brightly, sending clouds of smoke into the room. Before he could answer Usher, Dave began to cough. He turned slowly so that Usher would not be alarmed, and shoved the stove lid over the flames. But he still had a spasm of coughing, for he had been standing almost over the stove. Presently he ceased, and Usher smiled.
"Ready to beg, Davy?"
Dave shook his head and said hoarsely, his eyes watering, "I got a proposition to make to you, Will, but give me a drink of water first." Usher said,
"Get him a drink, Sholto, from that bucket in the corner,"
without looking at Sholto, and then he sneered.
"That's more like it, Davy. Beginning to crawfish, eh?"
Davy didn't answer, only coughed. Sholto got a cup of water, broke through the 5 men blocking the door, and came up to Dave holding out the cup. Dave's left hand was already extended to receive the cup. His other hand had his mouth smothering the cough. Just as he was about to take the cup, he reached out, yanked Sholto to him, and at the same time whirled him. Usher's gun came up, and then it was too late. Dave had pulled Sholto half around and now had his arms around him and pulled against his body so that Sholto shielded him. Dave jeered. "Don't shoot your $50,000, Will." Usher hesitated, and so did the other men. To kill Dave, they would have to shoot Sholto too. And in that second, Dave acted. He put his back to the sidewall and started moving along it toward the door, Sholto in front of him. He had traveled perhaps 8 feet when Usher came to his senses.
"Rush him, boys, he hasn't got a gun!"
And he followed his own advice. Dave pushed out from the wall with one leg and hurled Sholto toward the advancing men. And in the same movement, he kicked the table which tipped over the bottle with the candle and extinguished it. He let go of Sholto, hearing him collide with Usher, and threw himself at the feet of the others. He mowed one man down in the darkness, and the man shot. He rolled on, came to his feet, and dived for the door, tripping over the sill. But he lit in the grass this time, rolled, came to his feet, and ran in the darkness toward the meadow where he had left his horse. There was tumult in the cabin, and everyone was afraid to shoot. He heard Usher cursing wildly, and then a voice bawled, "There he goes, through the meadow!" There was a scattering of shots around him, and Dave dropped into the high grass and crawled away through it from the spot where he fell, but it was slow and exhausting work. They had him now. He could hear Usher's voice yelling, "Surround him!" In the darkness, a man's figure standing in the yellow grass made a blob of black against a lighter background. He had forgotten that. If he stood up, he'd be a target for the 6 of them. He lay there, breathing softly, wondering what he could do. If they started to move in on him, he might overpower one man and get a gun. But Usher had seen that too, and now he was yelling, "Don't move in on him! Stay where you are!" Dave poked his forehead above the grass. He could see them now. They were in a circle around him, a circle perhaps 40 yards in diameter. Suddenly a match flared in the direction from which Will Usher's voice came. The light died and then flared up again, and it was bigger this time. The flame grew, and suddenly Dave understood. Will was going to burn him out, set the grass on fire. There was just enough of a ground breeze riding off the peaks to fan the dry grass into flames, and Dave knew that once it was started, it would blaze with the heat of a blacksmith's forge. "Shoot anything that moves!" Usher shouted, and then he started out in the wake of the flames. They laid in a long line now that was spreading. It didn't matter to Usher if he set a forest on fire just so he caught Dave. For one panicked moment, Dave wondered what to do. Again he looked up, and now he counted the men. There were 7 of them, spaced at regular intervals around him, the light from the fire picking them out. He sank down again, cursing, and then something struck him. Usher had 6 men, counting himself. He'd counted 7. That meant that Sholto was guarding 2. Dave forced himself to think back to what had happened in the shack. Sholto hadn't struggled when he had been forced to make a shield for Dave, and it seemed to Dave that he had willingly smashed into Usher, upsetting his aim. It was worth a try, and it was his only chance. Again he raised up, studying these men's figures. They had the light in their eyes now and couldn't see him so well. He saw Sholto off to one side toward the middle of the meadow. Dave ducked down and set off in the heavy grass on his hands and knees toward Sholto. A panicked family of field mice ran over his hands, oblivious to anything but the fire that was chasing them. Dave could hear it crackle behind him and knew that it was burning on a wide front and was fanned by the wind. He paused and looked up again presently and saw Sholto 20 feet ahead of him, knee-deep in the grass. The light touched up the man's face, and again Dave was reassured. This wasn't a killer's face. He crawled on, and now he could see Sholto watching the grass that he was disturbing, and then he looked away and Dave's heart leaped. He headed straight for him, and still Sholto was looking out toward the fire. Dave passed within inches of him, and still Sholto didn't look at him. Dave stopped long enough to whisper, "Did they leave a gun in the shack?" "No," Sholto whispered. Dave vanished then. Usher, following the fire, was shouting instructions for them to watch closely, and Dave, traveling as fast as he could, headed for the nearest peninsula of timber that sloped down into the meadow. In another 2 minutes he had achieved it, and he put the point of land between him and the fire, then disappeared into the timber. Panting, he looked back at the scene. The circle of men still held, although the grass fire had eaten more than halfway through it. Those 6 men stood there with their guns drawn, waiting to collect their bounty on him. A sheepishness welled up in Dave as he looked at it. He had been a sucker, just like Will had said. He had forgotten that Will traveled with a wild bunch, headed it, and that this was the sort of gall that needed men to back it. Well, he'd have to kill Will Usher now. He was a nuisance, a dangerous nuisance, but that could wait. In a few minutes, these men would think of their horses, and Dave wanted to be away by that time. He pondered a moment and decided that Will would have tied the horses to the windward of the shack, lest Dave's mounts, when they approached, catch the scent of other horses and give away their presence. Therefore, he plunged into the timber, came presently to a ridge, crossed it, dropped down into a gully and walked up it, and found the horses in the dark. They were tied out in a thicket of scrub juniper, which they would tramp. The scent of evergreens would kill any other scent coming to them and keep them from whinnying. Swiftly then, Dave searched the saddles, and on one he found a carbine in the rifle scabbard. This was the horse he took, not even bothering to shorten the stirrups until he was clear. Once he was away from the shack, he dismounted, adjusted the stirrups, and considered his situation. Will had Sholto. He would collect ransom on him, just as they had planned together. For one moment, Dave pondered going back and taking Sholto, now that he had the gun, and then another thought occurred to him. Why not let Will Usher have all the grief of lugging Sholto around with him and sending a man for the ransom money? It would be easier to steal the money from Usher than steal Sholto from him. And that meant that he'd have to hunt up Wallace and watch him. And Wallace had probably been out with the posse which would return the Yellow Jacket. He set off in the night then, through the timber, headed for Yellow Jacket. Will Usher would keep. He was going to have a lot of fun with Usher before he killed him, and he wanted to figure out just what shape that fun would take. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Hardcase by Luke Short. Librivox recordings in the public domain. Chapter 6. Approximately 24 hours after the kidnapping of Sholto, the posse, headed by Sheriff Beale, came home to Yellow Jacket empty-handed. Wallace, who had driven himself and his men until they were ready to drop, dismounted warily at the tie rail in front of the sheriff's office alongside Ernie C. and Beale. The posse members who had borrowed guns from the sheriff's gun rack returned them and scattered to their homes. Wallace, as soon as he was inside the door of the sheriff's office, started the same song that Ernie had been listening to for 24 hours. "I can't get over it," Wallace said bleakly, his voice still savage. "Just because you were so knot-headed you wouldn't look into that coffin, Beale, I'm going to have to pay out a sweet piece of money." And Beale, harried and tired, gave the same exasperated retort he had been giving all night and day. "Damn it, man, you saw the coffin. If I'm a knothead, so are you." Ernie shucked off his shell belt and gun and said to Beale, "I'll be back after a while." He went out, sick of Wallace's grousing, smarting under it because he was included as a knothead too, and tired enough to fall asleep in the street. He cursed Dave Coyle with a bitterness that surprised even himself, and then he headed up street for a drink. Bruce McPhee, per Sheriff Beale's instructions, was in the custody of the 2 deputy U.S. Marshals at the hotel here. But he would go free, Ernie thought bitterly. There was no excuse to hold him now. He had disclaimed all knowledge of Dave Coyle and had pointed to his posting of the reward money for Dave's capture as evidence of innocence. But all that was phony, Ernie thought. Who stood to profit most by Sholto's disappearance? McPhee. And Ernie was willing to bet good money that none of them would ever see Sholto again. And while McPhee was taking his ease in a hotel room, laughing at them, Ernie and the posse had been riding the legs off their horses. And for nothing. The trail had petered out. Ernie tramped down the boardwalk, disgust riding his honest face. He wished fervently that both McPhee and Wallace would drop dead.
"Did you just come from the sheriff's office?"
a woman's voice said. Ernie pulled up and turned. A pretty dark-haired girl in a rusty black dress stood beside him. Ernie didn't know her, but he liked her looks. He touched his hat. "Yes'm."
"Is Mr. Wallace there?"
"He sure is," Ernie said grimly.
"When will he be ready to ride out to the place?"
"I don't know, miss. Why?"
"Well, I work out there," the girl said. "I was going out with him."
Ernie looked at her closely. Then he saw the wedding ring on her finger. For a moment he wondered if Wallace was married, and then he knew he wasn't. Probably some relative. Ernie said, "I wished you'd take him out and give us a little peace around this place."
"Will you tell him I'm waiting?"
"Sure," Ernie said. "What name?"
"He'll know,"
the girl said. She smiled her thanks and went down the street. Ernie watched for a moment, admiration in his eyes, and then started out for the saloon again. He had taken less than 3 steps when he heard someone call him again.
"Ernie! Oh, Ernie!"
He stopped patiently and saw old Bitterman, the hotel clerk, hobbling toward him. Ernie looked at him with a baleful gaze. Likely there was a towel missing from the hotel, and old Bitterman wanted a blanket warrant sworn out for all the guests until the towel was retrieved. "Well," Ernie said disgustedly when Bitterman faced him,
I found something while you were gone. I didn't know whether to save it or not." "What is it? A burned match?" Ernie asked sardonically. Bitterman looked aggrieved, but he pulled a folded envelope from his pocket. "It's an envelope," he said. Ernie took it, unfolded it, glanced at the writing, and then crumpled it up in his fist and threw it savagely in the gutter and said, "Ah, phooey." And then his face changed. He stood there a second, his face blank, and then he dived for the envelope. Retrieving it, he smoothed it out and read the address again. It was the envelope of Carol's letter to Dave Coyle. "Where'd you find this?" Ernie asked swiftly. "Why, the chambermaid found it in the room Coyle was in the other night," Bitterman said righteously. "I told you it was—" Ernie didn't even bother to hear him out. He turned and walked rapidly back to the sheriff's office, a plan already forming in his mind. And then his pace slowed. Wallace would still be there, and Ernie didn't want Wallace writing him on this business. He sauntered into the office. Wallace, his hat shoved on the back of his bony skull, was talking to Sheriff Beale, whose face was getting redder and redder. "I tell you," Wallace was saying, "either you arrest McPhee, Beale, or this is your last term of office." Beale spread his hands pleadingly and said, "On what grounds? In the name of all that's high and mighty and holy, on what grounds can I arrest him?" Ernie interrupted lazily. "Did McPhee and that girl of his sign them depositions?" Beale glared at him. "How could they? This maniac hasn't even let me have a minute free since I got back." "I'll take 'em," Ernie said. Beale fished around in the desk and got the depositions of McPhee and Carol. They were merely statements that they had no part in Dave Coyle's kidnapping of Sholto. Ernie took them and sauntered out the door, his message from the girl to Wallace forgotten. Wallace was talking again. Once on the street, Ernie almost ran up to the hotel. He stopped at the desk long enough to take old Bitterman's inkpot and pen, and then he went upstairs. A deputy, his chair back tilted against the wall of the corridor by McPhee's room, told Ernie McPhee was in. Ernie knocked and was bid enter. The room was a sitting room of the only suite in the hotel. Bruce McPhee, his hands folded behind his back, was pacing the floor. He whirled at Ernie's entrance and said savagely, "How long am I going to be kept here?" "Dad," Carol said, "be patient." She was sitting at a table playing a two-handed game of rummy with Senator Maitland. Ernie took off his hat and said, "It won't be long, Mr. McPhee. If you and Miss McPhee sign these depositions, I reckon the sheriff won't keep you much longer." Maitland, always the lawyer, said, "Let me see them." Ernie handed him the papers and put the pen and ink on the desk. His heart was beating wildly, and he hoped his face didn't show it. He stood there, hip-shot like a horse, while Maitland read over the depositions. "I think they're safe to sign," Maitland said. "They absolve you both of any complicity in the kidnapping of Sholto." Ernie's face didn't change. He only picked up the pen, dipped it in the ink, and handed it to Carol. She signed, and Ernie handed the pen to McPhee, who signed with a stiff hand his childish-looking signature. Ernie picked up the two papers, backed off across the room, dropped McPhee's deposition, and pulled out the envelope. It was Carol's writing on the envelope. He was certain now. He went to the door and said to the guard, "Step in here." When the bewildered deputy came through the door, Ernie said swiftly, "Put your gun on them and don't let them out of this room." He bolted out the door and ran down the stairs. McPhee, his face bewildered as the deputies looked at Maitland. "What did we sign?" Maitland looked puzzled too, but neither of them looked at Carol. If they had, they would have noticed that she was as pale as the white lace collar of her dress. McPhee started for the deposition that Ernie had dropped, but the deputy pulled up his gun. "You stay put," he said. In 2 minutes, Sheriff Beale and Ernie, both out of breath, came into the room. There was a look of triumph on Beale's face as he marched over to Carol and shoved the envelope at her. "Is that your writing?" he asked, half panting. Carol looked at it and her heart sank. She couldn't lie, not with their box number on the back of the envelope and a sample of her writing in Ernie C.'s hands. She said weakly, "Yes." "So you wrote him, did you?" Beale said. He wheeled to face McPhee. "Where do you get your mail and wagon mail?" "Why, Box 73 at the post office." "Ah," Beale said. He held the envelope in both hands for the puzzled McPhee to look at. "So you didn't arrange to meet Dave Coyle here and plan that kidnapping. There's the evidence in your own daughter's handwriting. She's admitted it. What do you say to that?" McPhee looked bleakly at Carol, and Carol ran into his arms. "Oh, Dad, I wrote him. I'm sorry. I hoped you wouldn't find out.
McPhee put his arms around her and stroked her hair while she sobbed on his chest.
What have you got to say, McPhee?
Bill drawled. On his rosy, innocent face was the look of a schoolboy who had just found a quarter.
Nothing,
McPhee said calmly. He looked bewildered, crushed.
Then I'll have to jail you,
Bill said calmly.
And if Judge Warburton gives you bond on this evidence, you can bet it will be so high that you can't meet it. 'Cause, Mr. McPhee, Sheriff Bill said angrily, I think Sholto has been murdered by your outlaw friend and you paid him to do it.
End of chapter 6.